Right, let's have that discussion that I promised you earlier on. South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry CEO, Mr. Alan Mkhoki, joins us for this reaction. I want to believe that we have him on the line. No, not yet. We'll move on to the other gentleman that we have with us, Dr. Thulasizwe Mkhabela. I'll start with you. Perhaps we could start with an understanding of the mapping when it comes to land ownership patterns, the demographics in South Africa, because a lot of what we hear is that the Constitution looks at restitution, redistribution, and the 10-year reform of securing land rights. What picture do the current numbers paint?
No, thank you very much, Audrey, and good evening to your listeners. I think maybe before I respond, we just put it in perspective that from what I'm hearing, you're referring to agricultural land. But I think this act that you're talking about goes beyond agricultural land per se in terms of redistribution and everything. So I will confine myself more to the agricultural side in terms of land ownership, because that's where I think I'm a bit more competent than the other spheres of the economy in terms of who owns land outside agriculture. Generally, the vast majority of land in terms of farming has historically been owned by white farmers. We all know the history that we come from as South Africa, and a lot of that land is still in the hands of white farmers. I'll use white and blacks just to make it clear to what we're talking about in terms of the discussion that we're having tonight. But there is also a substantial amount of land that is all in the hands of the state in terms of what the government owns, that it has bought from the willing seller, willing buyer approach that has been working in South Africa since the dawn of democracy. So there is a substantial amount of land that is available, which is in the hands of government for redistribution, that the government could also redistribute. And now the numbers are also increasing of farmers that are black farmers that are on commercial land, agricultural land. But I must put a rider there to say that most of those farmers do not own the land because the title deed is still vested in the state. I think I will leave it at that for now, just as an opening remarks.
That's perfectly fine. And we'll come back to try and get nuance to the numbers that you've given us. Dr. Firsing, a lot of what we've heard today is that there's been quite a bit of misinterpretation of what the Act talks about. Some saying perhaps it's deliberate, the misinformation that we've been seeing happening. Do you think that there's been room left for misinterpretation? And if so, where are those gaps and how could they have been filled?
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on. I think really you have to put this in context in a broader sense of what's going on in South Africa-U.S. relations. So this is one small snippet. Really, you have to go back to Trump's campaign promises and really how he actually won the re-election. So he campaigned on an America First policy. And a lot of it comes down to America right now is in $34 trillion in debt. And we're giving a lot of humanitarian aid to countries. And South Africa is a big recipient of this aid. So a couple of his first executive orders passed on the day of his inauguration was to now analyze and evaluate where this money is going, because America as a country has issues. So PEPFAR is one of the biggest programs where South Africa receives money, and it's been over $7 billion over the past couple of years. So to answer your question, they're really trying to see America's interests. Secretary of State Rubio made it very clear that the American government is not a charity, and that there's going to have very strict stipulations on trade, but also humanitarian aid. So does it make America stronger? Does it make it more prosperous? And does it make America safer? So these are kind of these lenses that the President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio are putting up. And when they get upset about certain actions like South African governments, whether it's land or their relationships with China or the way they treat Taiwan or their dealings with Russia and military engagement or Ukraine or Hamas, these are the things they're looking at as a whole. So you need to really take into account all these factors.
Yeah. Let's go to the BRICS Business Council now, Mr. Nicolaou. There's been talk that perhaps South Africa is not taking full advantage when it comes to BRICS, that there are other markets that can be looked at. When you look at U.S. President Donald Trump's policy and how he's perhaps looking at the Expropriation Act, trying to pander to the right wing, Is it time for South Africa to really look into what it can attain when it comes to the BRICS partnerships?
So look, I'm first and foremost a healthcare guy, and thanks very much for having me on. And I think I need to start with the aid, and it's quite dangerous to communicate via tweets. So I think we all need to take a couple of steps back. Our president has reached out to President Trump to seek an engagement to clarify exactly what the position is around land. There certainly haven't been any land seizures that I'm aware of, or anything that's been speculated in the media and in tweets. And I think we've got to allow the two presidents, if it is possible, to have that conversation and allow the necessary clarity to unfold. But let me just focus for a moment on the worst case scenario, which is what happens if all the foreign aid, particularly for healthcare programs, gets disrupted. And remember that the US is a significant contributor to these healthcare programs, not only in South Africa. I mean, arguably we are the least dependent, but you've got to look at the continent holistically here. And the concern is that if you do get disruption of these programs, then you could see HIV/AIDS coming back with a vengeance. It's in nobody's best interest, because these pandemics spread, you have a contagion effect, and before you know it, they've bounced over to Europe and into the US, and that can't be in anybody's best interest, not even the United States' best interest. So I think there's a plausible reason why you'd want this clarity around land to take place so that these programs can continue into the future. And we've seen quite clearly what pandemics do to economies. They devastate economies, lives, and livelihoods. And I think first and foremost, that's what we've got to take into consideration here, is the human and humanitarian effect and what that would do if HIV/AIDS were to bounce back.
Yeah, we've seen government really trying to clarify their communication when it comes to this act. We had the president's spokesperson, Mr. Magwenya, also a number of media houses today just trying to really debunk some of the theories that have come from this act. When it comes to government communication, how would you rate it as far as we've come to the point that, you know, there's been room for this manipulation of what this act speaks to?
Are you asking me?
Yes,
so
yes,
let
that's
me
precisely
first.
to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, look, I think there's a new administration with a new philosophy sitting in Washington, D.C. It's 12 days or something old. I think it's not even 2 weeks old. And I think what is really critical to plug any gaps in communication is that at the highest level, whether it's Minister Lamola and his counterpart, Secretary Rubio, having a conversation, or ideally President Ramaphosa to Trump, to clarify what these positions are, that will help fill any gaps. Of course, it's all well and good having people like us from the business community on the call, and we can tell you our interpretation of land reform in the country. But I think this is a conversation that's got to be held at the highest level, the two highest officers in the two countries. I think it is possible for South Africa and the US to collaborate. You asked me about the BRICS position earlier. And as a BRICS Business Council, we've always held a view that South Africa's got to look at where its best economic interests lie. They lie in the East, in the West, and in the South. And we're going to, I'm afraid, have to do this balancing act to achieve that. What we seek as a country is we seek to grow our economy at economic levels that are deserving of the potential that we hold as a country. And I think that's the way we've got to view these things. But the first step here is we have to clarify our position very clearly. There's got to be a building of relationships. Clearly, the relationships are almost at an all-time low, and we need to restore those. But lastly, I think we need to make a compelling case in this instance why it's not in anybody's best interest that there's a disruption of aid. We were encouraged as a healthcare sector that there was a waiver called a 90-day waiver called, and the resumption of some of these programs. I think that's a positive development. But now we need to put a good and plausible case, not only as South Africa, but as an African continent, why it would be immensely disruptive to both Africa and the rest of the world, including the US, if you start getting a spread of HIV, AIDS, and TB, which is the programs that PEPFAR and other foreign aid is particularly seized with.
Yeah. Dr. Mkhabela, I want us to look at the history of US foreign policy, particularly when it comes to the issue of land reform. I believe back in the 1950s, when you look at countries such as South Korea, that was actually funded, particularly by the United States. But it seems to differ when it comes to colonial countries. We've seen what happened in Zimbabwe. We see it now possibly happening in South Africa again. What would you attribute that to, that inconsistency?
Thank you very much. It's a tricky one to actually respond to. But what I would say is that you are correct in saying that the response of the powers that be, like the USA, is quite different when it comes to colonial issues like South Africa is. And I think the other issue is, like it's been said already, is that the policy, especially of the current administration in the USA, is that it's America first. So America is also looking at its own interest, where it stands to benefit the most or where it stands to be affected if a particular policy does not favor the position that they hold in terms of land redistribution, for example, in this case. I think land reform and land redistribution is a national issue in any particular country that the countries themselves should be seized with in terms of solving. The outside world, as it were, can come in to assist the South Africa in this case to actually deal with the land reform, voicing their own concerns with their concerns, but you cannot hold a gun, as it were, over a particular government to do things a particular way so that you can get what you want out of it. I think we, as the African continent, we need to move away from actually relying too much on what the Western world says is the best way to deal with reforms, whether the economic reforms, whether the land reforms, and actually have a homegrown approach to it that is based on empirical evidence of what has worked elsewhere and what has not worked. And so, having said so, I really don't want to speak on the US policy when it comes to land reform itself. I think the US is better placed to respond to that themselves.
Okay, perhaps we'll try with Dr. Firsing. You answer this for me, if you will. Why do you think, what places South Africa rather in this unique place when it comes to perhaps being a target of the United States at the moment when it comes to the Expropriation Act and all the reaction that we've seen, all the threats, the trade threats that we've seen as well coming from Donald Trump? Is there anything in particular that speaks to why South Africa would be a target for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a multitude of issues. I mean, Trump almost did the exact same tweet going back to August 2018 on the land issue. So it's something they've been watching. The second term, I think he's really surrounded himself with billionaire business people. So he's basically treating the American government now like a business. So it's pretty simple. I mean, South Africa is going to have to put on their sales and marketing hat in the next couple months, because you do have the end of AGOA. September is when it expires. So that's a big trade deal. You've got, of course, South Africa chairing the G20, which was in your promo video. But basically what they need to prove is the return on investment. That's what America is looking for now. And even the American public, while they voted for Trump, we have issues here, like our U.S.-Mexico border. Why can we not get hit by a hurricane in North Carolina, but we can't help our own people in L.A. wildfires, but we're giving $100 billion to the African continent to fight AIDS? So it's really, from Trump, he's a deal maker, he's a businessman, he's surrounded with people like Elon Musk that think of a very similar mindset. He wants to cut wasteful expenditure. So it's really up to the South African government, but also the business community to say, hey, South Africa, we have platinum, we've got certain minerals you need for the future of your technology sector. Speak to those points, and you've really got to get into the nitty gritty. Why, if we give healthcare money to the South African government or to the NGOs, what does that do for America? Does that increase business relationships, for job opportunities? What is it? What are the benefits on both sides? And I think if they do that, it's going to definitely go a long way, but it's going to take a lot of sales and a lot of dialogue.
Yeah, and perhaps, Mr. Nicolaou, when we come back from this caller, you could talk about what is the point of having a dialogue if it appears that, one of the role key players, being Mr. Trump in this case, is perhaps misinformed. I'm told we have a caller, Frank, who's calling us from Limpopo. Very good evening to you. Frank, could you tell us what your thoughts are today?
Yeah, thank you very much, ma'am. You see, the issue of Trump is becoming very problematic, especially on our country, South Africa, whereby we're being threatened. And if you check, Trump was given this information of expropriation of land without compensation by the left forces, which are the DA. And remember, DA did not support this motion even in the era of Jacob Zuma. So I think it's high time as African countries or South Africa to do things on our own. Because again, if you check on the sanction of that issue of health where they cut the budget, it's only 17%. I don't think it will affect our country as such. So I think big up to Ramaphosa for standing firm to say Trump must do his own things in America, we'll do our own things in South Africa. Because currently, we are in suffering, whereas we are in the country, whereas there's a budget which is coming in the country, but as the poor, far-flung areas in Limpopo, we are suffering even today. We don't see those budgets. So it's fine, let them cut that budget or let them sanction us so that we can see whether indeed we're getting the begging from America. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Frank, giving us a call there from Limpopo, talking about how perhaps it is time to cut the umbilical cord that South Africa can do without most of this aid. Is that even feasible, Mr. Nicolaou?
Look, as I said earlier, I don't think the conversation's solely about South Africa. I think what we need to keep in mind is that when you're dealing with infectious pandemics, because you get non-infectious ones like diabetes, etc. But when you're dealing with infectious ones, the reason that PEPFAR was incepted, and I was highly seized with this in the early 2000s and watched this very closely at the time. The reason the US government decided to set up PEPFAR at the time was that there was a concern that Africa was bearing the brunt of HIV and AIDS. And these pandemics don't respect any borders. So if things escalate again in South Africa and the rest of the African continent, the virus in a modified form will jump across the sea into Europe, will jump across the Atlantic into the US. And then you have a contagion effect. And we saw what happens when you cannot control pandemics. We saw that with COVID. The world woke up to a new reality that if you have these destructive pandemics, they'll end up destroying economies, and no one can afford that. So for me, the most compelling reason, it's not just about South Africa here. It's about an African continent that harbors 70% of the world's HIV infection rate, and how that could spread to other parts of the world, disrupt supply chains like we saw in 2020 and 21 with COVID, and then unfortunately all economies get affected. So I think what we've got to try and prevent here is sense has to prevail. I think we've got to dial down the rhetoric and look at measured, sober responses, put our case forward, which is what I think President Ramaphosa was saying, and we've got to prevent HIV/AIDS coming back with a vengeance, because lastly, if it does come back with a vengeance, then the current crop of drugs that we have, the virus develops resistance to those. And then all of a sudden, you've got to use new drugs. They cost a lot more. And the global fallout to that is not a very good one. And that's what we need to be preventing here.
Yeah, I understand what you mean, Mr. Nicolaou, except the people of South Africa are concerned about what affects them directly at the moment. And that has been the discourse in the public today, because they're concerned about what these lobby groups, particularly AfriForum, could possibly cause to the country when it comes to some of the utterances and rhetorics, as you have mentioned, are perpetuated as facts. Again, the issue of dialogue. Who do we know who's speaking to Mr. Trump? And the fact that he speaks of an investigation, but initially talking about positively and confirming that, you know, all these atrocities are happening in South Africa, people are being treated badly, and it appears he's already made up his mind. What is the point of a dialogue with the man who seems to have made up his mind, Mr. Nicolaou?
Well, I think firstly, these infectious diseases are interlinked. So we are less exposed in South Africa, correct? But these viruses cross borders. Before you know it, they spread. So that's why I'm looking at this as an African issue, not necessarily just South Africa, because we are less exposed in South Africa, but viruses know no borders, as I was saying. Secondly, who's speaking to who here? The understanding is that there is going to be an investigation, rightfully or wrongfully. I'm not saying it's a right or wrong thing to do, but we do have an opportunity. I think we've got an embassy in Washington, D.C. We've got a newly appointed ambassador. Our president has reached out to the U.S. president, and I think those provide the channels and the opportunities to have a reasonable, sober, and measured dialogue, if that's at all possible. I mean, that's our best chance of success here. But we also should look at this relationship very much as Scott was saying earlier. It's going to be a transactional relationship, whether we like it or not, right?
Right.
And we've got to look at what works transactionally on both sides as we forge ahead. And it's not just about foreign aid. It's about how do we manage a relationship for the next 4 years with what is likely to be a more transactional administration.
Okay, Dr. Mkhabela and Dr. Firsing, I'll come back to you after this call very quickly. We have Dango calling us from Johannesburg. Very good evening to you, Dango. What would you like to contribute to this conversation tonight?
Good evening. I'd like to say, that South Africans need to be more patriotic, that South Africans need to act together, and that South Africans acting together can actually present the South African case to whoever it may be. And we don't have to be in anybody's camp, and we don't have to be in anybody's defense. But I think one of the consequences of the possible cutting of funds could be to all the NGOs who are opposed to the ANC also having their funds cut, which may be a good thing in the end.
Right, Dango, thank you for your contribution. Certainly appreciated, Dango, that is calling us from Johannesburg. Dr. Firsing, the issue of the Rainbow Nation and showing unity when there seems to be an attack on the nation and on the country. But how does a nation come together when it appears there's a certain group of people that is said to be needing protection from another, and this is coming from a world leader?
Yeah, no, it's just to give context to Nicola's point. So everything's under investigation at the moment, just so your viewers understand that the State Department and other agencies are looking at the bilateral relationship, and we're expecting reports by the 1st of April to what the investigations find. But it's important to understand that there's also a business to business. Like most people, young Africans, for example, and young Americans, they need jobs. So besides healthcare and PEPFAR, there's also a $25 billion bilateral trade relationship between the U.S. and South Africa, which is very important. The U.S. companies in South Africa, like Ford, General Electric, Black & Veatch, they employ about 150,000 South Africans. There's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of income and money for families. So yes, there's aid money, but there's also the commercial relationship and the cultural connections between the U.S. and South Africa, tourism. So you really got to take that into account. And I'm personally rooting for South Africa. I've spent 10 years living there. Two of my daughters were born there. They're South Africans and Americans. So you got to, it's really, Trump is one thing, but it's also, we have to lobby Congress with ALGOA. We've got the G20, like I mentioned before, the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit is coming up. And it's a difficult spot. There's no U.S. ambassador to South Africa at the moment, but there are opportunities for dialogue, and a lot of these meetings in D.C. are going to be very, very important.
Right. Gentlemen, we have to leave it there for now. We're going to take a very short break. When we come back, we continue with the discussion, taking a look at what international law looks like and in terms of dialogue to make sure that there is level-headed people that are having this discussion amongst this global trade wars, as it would appear. Stay with us. Welcome back to Newsfeed PM. We continue with our conversation with regards to US President Donald Trump's utterances, threats when it comes to global trade and trade with South Africa. We have a panel that is helping us understand in terms of international law and in terms of global dialogue. What needs to happen? Do we need to have level heads, and who needs to have that conversation? We're getting reaction from you at home as well. We certainly appreciate it. We have a couple of messages from WhatsApp. We have one that reads, I think this thing is also about BRICS. Trump is exercising his powers, although it will affect ordinary South African citizens. Thank you, Tendai Taylor Kadriti. We have more reaction on WhatsApp. Trump is an impulsive populist that speaks before he thinks. He ensures that he surrounds himself with yes men to boost his ego, and his impulsive actions will ensure that the US will be alienated, which will be detrimental to its people. Thank you for that WhatsApp, Bjorn Ranch from Atlantis in Cape Town. More reaction there. South Africa needs to consider arranging talks with the United States to address this issue as soon as possible. Otherwise, the majority of South Africans will be affected by the shortages of ARVs. Semi Matebula from Mambumbu. The last one, by appealing to a foreign power, the DA and AfriForum are undermining the South African constitution and the rule of law. They are about to be extremely embarrassed. They're underestimating our leaders and Trump's intelligence. This will not end well for them. That's Litabo Sikile from Centurion there, giving us their reaction. We also have a caller on the line, Yanga from Lusikisiki. Very good evening to you. Thank you for your call. What is your reaction to the conversation we're having tonight?
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I'd just like to say that it's very disappointing that, first of all, you get a leader of such an important country communicating through channels that are not diplomatic. And secondly, I think what's more disappointing is that Elon Musk seems to be pushing an agenda of trying to isolate South Africa as a country. We don't know what the hidden agendas are, but obviously they are. And what's more disappointing is white South Africans that are actually perpetuating this, especially online, knowing that it's not true and that it has no evidence. Well, it's very disappointing. That's what I'd like to say. And then it does affect our relationship with the United States, which is our second biggest trading partner. And I think both people will suffer from both countries because they are benefiting as well as we are as well. But then things like this do hurt relationships of countries. And I think our president has been calm, which is very good. And I just hope this ends well, because the president of the United States is misinformed about this. Whoever is telling him this has a hidden agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanga, calling us there from Lusikisiki. Talking once again about misinformation, misinterpretation, and just huge disappointment of leaders that seem to be reactive and speak outside of diplomatic channels before understanding exactly what is happening. I want to come back to you, Dr. Firsing, because I think earlier before the break, we're talking about the issue of having level heads and having a dialogue. Yeah. I want us to talk... Yeah. Oh, you can hear me loudly?
Yeah, no, perfect. I can see you actually. We're going.
Okay, perfect. One of the complaints is when you have lobby groups that are not government actors, but speak to issues that affect the nation, such as AfriForum and other lobby groups that we've heard about. Some have gone as far as saying that it's treasonous. Of course, there is the freedom of association, which comes within the Bill of Rights, and people are allowed to do that. But where does one draw the line?
Well, associations play a role in every sector, whether it's agricultural, land, mining, aerospace. It's just a part of foreign policy and bilateral relations. There's chambers of commerce. There's various associations so that's really nothing new in terms of foreign policy or bilateral relations. So it's important. I think what we're missing here with the Trump 2.0, or what you want to call it, is looking back for the last 30 years, there was always, we started something called the U.S. South Africa Binational Commission, and Obama started something called the Strategic Dialogue between our two countries. And there was really some personal, you saw a relationship between, when I was living in South Africa for 10 years, between Obama and Zuma. President Zuma had a good rapport And even going back to Madiba and President Clinton and Mbeki and Al Gore also had this kind of connection. Okay, we didn't have Twitter back then or email or that, but those personal connections, whether as part of trade associations or at a presidential level or vice president or congressional, are really important. I mean, often the public don't see these trade delegations or conferences that take place in South Africa or across the African continent, but they're really important to really fostering communication, dialogue, and focusing on the positive. Because you could say, from the American perspective, they keep poking America, taking Israel to The Hague, or they're having a Russian ship dock like Lady R back in 2023, or their relations with Putin in Ukraine. But you could also argue that Ramaphosa, they want peace, world peace. You could say Trump wants to be a peacemaker. He wants to end wars. So there's some synergy there. So we need to really focus on the positive. I think it's going to be important. And then have various people in the room to try to get to those goals and meet those ambitions.
Yeah. Dr. Mkhabela, I know you don't want to shy away, will not speak when it comes to issues of policy, and I absolutely understand that. You said your area of expertise is agricultural land and just the outcome of the mapping of that within South Africa. Now, with all this discourse we're having about land, do you think with the Expropriation Act, anything is likely to change with regards to that?
If I understand you well, you mean, is land reform going to be better or worse off because of the Act? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, please go ahead and answer that.
My perspective is that not much is going to change. I think, like the president responded, saying that this Expropriation Act, is not a confiscation act. It's not about taking land away from people. It's just a safeguard that government felt they needed when there's an issue of public interest that needed to be addressed by land, and there was no other mechanism to actually implement that. So the long and short of my response is that I don't think much will change because of the Expropriation Act that has been enacted in Parliament recently. I think land reform has to proceed the way it was conceptualized, but must be expedited in the sense that more land must be given to people that were previously not allowed access to agricultural land. And so far, the willing seller, willing buyer method has been working in South Africa. Personally, I don't think there has been a need to expropriate farms in order to redistribute land to black farmers. I think, like I said in my opening remarks, there's enough land that can be redistributed, and there are enough white farmers that are willing to sell their land, and there's a lot of land in the market. So I don't think anything will change in the near future.
Yes, because I think part of the fear-mongering that's been happening is the issue of food security, if there's any tampering that happens with agricultural land. And it is your understanding that that is not likely to happen.
Yes, and we've actually said that before, that expropriation without compensation when it comes to agriculture will be detrimental also to the end goal that South Africa is trying to achieve in terms of an equitable agricultural sector. It will disrupt the well-established agricultural sector that we have, which we need, and it will also not serve the interest of the people that government will be trying to bring into the mainstream of agriculture. So we've advised, as a number of us, that expropriation without compensation, we've not reached a point where that is an instrument that needs to be used in order to address the issue of land redistribution in the agricultural space. And if that were to happen, there is empirical evidence that it would affect food security. It would also affect the productivity of the sector and our competitiveness internationally, which is what we need in actually to have a strong footing when we go to those negotiations and the dialogue with the likes of the USA and other big players that we trade with internationally. So we need to have a competitive sector, and we should never kill the goose that lays the golden egg.
Yes, and I suppose what you're saying speaks to what the Act talks about when it comes to land that is not productive and land that has been abandoned. And I think that perhaps that's where some of that confusion has been coming from. I understand we have another caller from Johannesburg once again. Owen, good evening to you.
Good evening. How are you, Audrey?
Very well, thank you. Please go ahead.
No, what I think what's happening here is Donald Trump is pressing a reset button for the U.S. foreign policy. Hence, everybody is talking Hello?
Yes, Owen, go ahead. We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, I'm saying he is pressing a reset button for the U.S. foreign policy. Hence, every country is in one trouble or another. If you look at Mexico and Canada, the tariffs, retaliation, we are dealing with someone who is capricious here. And he's megalomania. He's very, very thirst for power. And he wants to reset the foreign policy of the U.S. so that everybody can respect the U.S. the way they did before fraternizing countries like China and Russia. Even the BRICS element comes into play here. I doubt very much if he is indeed going to execute all that he is saying. All he's doing is to reset the U.S. supremacy as a global power. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen, from Johannesburg, saying it's a reset button for foreign policy. Coming from the Democrats now into Republicans being in power, of course, Donald Trump being from that party. Robert in Cape Town, thank you for your call.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for taking my call. Firstly, the two panel experts you have are evading your question. They really ought to answer it directly instead of beating around the bush. The second thing, that we as a country, we need to redress the inequalities of apartheid, and it's long overdue. The land question and many other questions have to be addressed. And we should not allow anybody, any country to bully us in things that are against our national interests. Now, the people that are advising Trump sound very much to me like white supremacists, and they assume that we in this country are terrorizing white people, and that is wrong. We shouldn't be bullied, and we ought to advise him and tell Donald Trump that, look, this is the reality here, and he needs to understand that.
Right, Robert from Cape Town, thank you for your comments. We certainly appreciate it. Robert here says we are not hitting straight to the point with my panel here. Owen calling us from Johannesburg, also talking about how Trump is resetting the button for foreign policy. I want to come to you, Mr. Nicolaou. Some are arguing that the nature of Donald Trump has never been conventional, and perhaps we should not be reacting to everything that he says. Of course, when it's as serious as what he spoke about, whether was it today or yesterday, about believing that these atrocities are happening in South Africa, then that must be addressed. But when it comes to the gravity of the issues that he speaks about, that it's simply going to be a very long 4 years if we jump at everything that he says.
Yeah, so Audrey, I think, as I said earlier, this calls for cool, calm, and measured heads. And I think that's what we've got in President Ramaphosa's response. He has reached out to have a dialogue to clarify what the reality is, both on the ground, but also what is meant through the act. And I think that's a really important first step to take on. It also provides an opportunity, and this is what Scott was saying, for us to explore where the synergies lie on both sides, synergies and complementarities. At the end of the day, the world can't wish itself away. We're a globalized economy, and as much as there's MAGA or put America first and all the rest of it, the reality is that the world does have a co-dependence on each other. And I think we've got to use this opportunity to reset the relationship between the United States and South Africa. We can't wish each other away. I think we've got to find the synergies and the complementarities. I think we can expect, as we said earlier, a more transactional administration in the Trump administration. And the way to deal with that is to look at the complementarities and the synergies, and to reset the relationship, which has been faltering for at least the last 2 years.
Right, as we wrap up, Mr. Firsing, when it comes to redress, retributions in South Africa, some are saying perhaps that's a conversation that we're skirting around, and how South Africa is unique in terms of its history and how this act is quite important. What are your thoughts around that as we wrap up this conversation?
Well, I mean, yeah, every country has its history, and I mean, I think it's an internal issue that South Africans themselves have to deal with. Again, we we're for a part, and we look at development and democracy. We try to support where we can. America and South Africa are democracies, and it's a very, very important point in our cultural history in the last 30 years. It's something we share. We don't share, it's the same with China. We have issues, but I mean, the bigger point talked about before with the BRICS, it really is a reset. We've been skirting around a lot of these issues for 30 years. South Africa's been walking a tightrope and a balance act, and they overall have usually done a pretty good job. But unfortunately, I think we're at a point now, and Trump campaigned on this and his team with Elon, and there's a lot of South Africans involved in his administration. David Sachs was born in South Africa. He's his crypto czar. Of course, Elon was born and raised in South Africa. So we need to really channel those conversations and have that going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. I certainly appreciate it. Dr. Mkhabela, we also had Mr. Nicolaou and Dr. Firsing speaking to us this evening. The conversation doesn't need to end here. You have our social media platforms. You can tell us what you think needs to happen going forward, and how this dialogue can be approached in the most pragmatic manner.